I decided to become a philosopher. By the way, if you guys could set the time up here, that'd be helpful so I don't go super long and crowd anyone else out. Yeah, that's just considered the most irrelevant thing, and Jim just mentioned Barbara Boxer, and in fact, when I went in front of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee 2 years ago, she reassured me that I had no business talking about energy.
Mr. Epstein, are you a scientist?
No, philosopher.
You're a philosopher?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is the Environment and Public Works Committee. I think it's interesting we have a philosopher here talking about an issue.
It's to teach you how to think more clearly.
Well, you don't have to teach me how to think more clearly.
So I did not have that planned, but it's just what came to mind because I really believe that it's true. I actually believe that of all the subjects that we need right now at a time where we've got so much opportunity to advance this country forward energy-wise and also so much peril, I think that philosophy is a crucial subject. And before I go into why that is, I just want to share with you what I want to cover today, which is really not so much the moral case for fossil fuels, but how you can use the moral case for fossil fuels to be far more influential over the conversation today. So I think that's what's really needed. People in this room have a lot more knowledge than the average person, to say the least, about these issues. What I want to try to be useful on is how to be far more persuasive, how to win more people over. And that's something over the years I feel like I've had a lot of success at. And in fact, we started doing studies about before and after people encountered my work, what happened to them. And for instance, we saw that in terms of people who felt confident turning non-supporters into supporters, you had a doubling. Or people who felt an understanding of the positive impacts of the fossil fuel industry on our environment, that also increased dramatically. And routinely I get notes like this. This is a kid from Harvard who talked about me changing his mind on fossil fuels. This is someone I spoke to who considered themselves a Marxist and now runs pro-fossil fuel study groups. And what they're being persuaded by, I think, is something very definite that I think that we could do a lot more of as a movement. And it really comes down to one word. There's one key, I think, to being far more influential and persuasive. And I'll give you a hint. The word begins with F. Can anyone guess what it is? Flattery? No. Freedom? Fact? Fracking? I might have heard flourish. No. Flourishing, that's close, that's going to be close. But actually, the word is framework. It's a framework. I think the reason philosophy is so valuable is because philosophy deals with frameworks. Now, when I say framework, what I mean is a framework is a starting structure. So just as when you build a building, it has a starting structure, and that determines and influences everything else about the building, so with any thought process or any conversation, it's built on a certain framework. And I think what happens is we often get sucked into a framework that's not the right way of thinking of it, and then we fall into that framework and we try to argue within that framework. And I think the reason that I have had a lot of success on this issue is that coming from a philosophical background, I very quickly found the framework that we were using to think about energy and to talk about energy to be deeply wrong, and then I was able to challenge it. So I want to just share my journey thinking about the framework and challenging the framework, because I think that's the key thing to do. The thing that got me interested in energy in the first place was the truth characterized by these graphs, which is that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing, to human beings living at their best, because cheap, plentiful, reliable energy allows us to go from a manual labor society to a machine labor society. And that empowers us to get machines to do our work for us and just leads to more prosperity, more power in every area of life. And I became really interested, okay, if energy is so important, that means that our decisions about energy are going to be very leveraged. They're going to matter so much because making energy better is going to make everything better. and making energy worse is going to make everything worse. And so I thought about, okay, well, how good is our thinking about energy? And I pretty quickly concluded it's very, very bad. And when I say it's bad, I don't mean that quote unquote dumb people, the uneducated, are thinking badly. I mean that so-called smart people, the super educated people, are thinking about it very badly. And there are three big ways. I think today's energy conversation is biased, I think it's sloppy, and I think it's anti-human. So just to give you some examples that convince me of this, so in terms of biased, one thing is when we're looking at something like CO2, we need to clearly look at both potential positives and potential negatives. And I learned in school, like, okay, CO2 has a fertilizing effect on plants. And so it was really surprising that when people talked about the influence of CO2, they almost never mentioned global greening, which is a significant thing. But however significant it is, it would just make sense logically if you were going to be fair on the issue to talk about the potential positives and negatives, and yet they ignored it, which made me think that there's a certain bias here that's not going to lead us to the right conclusion. Or when I started studying the issue of fracking, hydraulic fracturing, and more broadly shale energy, I saw that when people talked about fracking, they would be obsessed with, oh, it's going to contaminate water. And yet when I studied it, the basic operations of fracking are incredibly unlikely to contaminate water, and much less likely to contaminate water than certain parts of the production of solar energy, such as waste disposal and mining. And yet people only talk about water danger with fracking and not with solar. So again, there's a bias. In our framework of discussing these issues, there's an idea that it's okay to be biased as long as you're for solar and wind and against fossil fuels and nuclear. And I didn't know what the truth was, but I knew that if we had this bias, we could never reach the right answer. Now there's also this, the worst form of bias, I think, is the term climate change denier. Because think about what this means. When I looked into the so-called climate change deniers, what I saw is actually their view was that any potential risks of CO2 were far outweighed by the benefits of fossil fuels, which is a completely coherent type of argument. And yet the people calling them climate change deniers, what they're basically saying is, it's not okay to talk about the benefits. It's only okay to talk about the negatives. And so if you support fossil fuels, that must mean you deny any potential negatives. Now, it doesn't mean I think there are negatives, but the logic of their argument is that it's invalid to consider the potential positives of fossil fuels. And if you talk about that and if you think they're positive, then we're going to attack you and analogize you to a Holocaust denier. So this is just really, really bad. Now, the discussion is also sloppy. So in addition to only looking for positives with solar and wind and only looking for negatives with fossil fuels and nuclear, there's a huge tendency toward exaggeration depending on people's biases. So for example, we have Elon Musk, and he talks about he's leaving the presidential council. Why? Because climate change is real. Now, think about how vague and sloppy that is. Climate change is real. To know if it's a problem, quote unquote, climate change, we need to know how significant is it? How significant is its effect on human life? And then what is that relationship to any positives of fossil fuels? If you just say climate change is real, that's like you're talking about vaccines and you say, oh, vaccine side effects are real, therefore it should be against vaccines. Well, no, it depends on how big the side effects are and how big the benefits are. So if I support vaccines, it doesn't mean I'm a vaccine side effect denier. It just means that I have a different evaluation. One thing I saw when I started studying the science was people just completely misrepresented the greenhouse effect. They said, oh, the greenhouse effect is real, leads to warming, but they weren't clear on the nature of the effect. And as I explain in my book a lot, it's a logarithmic or diminishing effect, which means that when you isolate the effect, each new molecule of CO2 warms less than the last. But if people were precise about that, we wouldn't probably be nearly as scared about warming. So there's just this sloppiness, which is really, really bad. And this 97% of climate scientists agree is the same kind of sloppiness. Agree on what? Climate change is real? Again, that's meaningless. It's sloppy. So if we're biased and sloppy in this way, we're guaranteed to make bad decisions. And sea level rise, we hear about, unprecedented sea level rise, yet even Wikipedia acknowledges that today's sea level rise is tiny compared to that experienced by our ancestors 10,000+ years ago. So there's just this bias and sloppiness that make it impossible to determine the truth. It doesn't mean that fossil fuels are necessarily good. It just means that our discussion is necessarily bad. one more of these is when people talk about solar and wind capacity. Oh, they're building up this huge capacity, but they neglect that the capacity of an unreliable, uncontrollable source of energy is totally different than the capacity of a reliable source of energy. So when people say, oh, it's 100 megawatts of solar and 100 megawatts of coal, those are two totally different things. That's like saying, oh, it's a worker who works 40 hours a week, which is like the coal worker and is reliable, versus the worker who works 12 hours a week and you don't know when they're going to come in. They have the same quote-unquote capacity. Well, that's a real distortion. The worst part, though, the deepest thing that's wrong, I believe, is that our conversation is anti-human. And the issue in philosophy this relates to is whenever we're talking about any issue, we're talking about making the right choice or the wrong choice, we have to be really clear about what's our standard of good, or what's our standard of value. How are we measuring good and bad? Now, the way that I measure good and bad is by human flourishing, by how much a given course of action is going to benefit human beings now and in the long run. But what I noticed was, in the popular conversation, there was almost no concern about human flourishing. For example, the energy poverty issue. There are about 3 billion people in the world with next to no energy. And remember, energy is fundamental to human flourishing. And we talk about energy every day, and nobody cares. There's like a 30,000 word hit piece in the New York Times the other day, and it's completely unimportant to mention energy poverty and the need for energy. That was trivial. That didn't make the 30,000 word cut in their magazine. And yet, what do we agonize about every day? We agonize about, oh, a polar bear had to move from one piece of ice to another. And a polar bear is literally my favorite animal, but there's still just a very problematic thing of being worried about it, particularly because you have more polar bears than before. But why don't we care about human flourishing? And the reason is because the standard of good in our discussion is not human flourishing, it's being green. And green means unchanged nature or minimum impact. And I think green is a horrible standard to use because human beings survive by impacting nature. We survive by transforming nature. So if we try to evaluate our energy choices by how green they are, we're going to end up making anti-human energy choices, and we're going to very much dislike the effective sources of energy, such as fossil fuels, nuclear, and hydro. And guess what? Guess which sources of energy the Greens oppose? Not the ones that just emit CO2, because they oppose nuclear and hydro, which are the best non-carbon ones. They oppose any practical form of energy. They only support imaginary energy, energy that they claim will be practical in the future, and then if it ever works, then they're against it. Because if you're green in the true sense, you're against industry, you're against industrial progress, you're against effective energy. So what I noticed was that the framework in our culture inevitably made people against fossil fuels because it was biased and sloppy and anti-human. And one lesson to draw is that unless we can change people's framework, then they're going to process anything we say, including any claims to fact, they're going to process it in that biased, sloppy, and anti-human way. So we need to somehow get around that. And in my own research, when I started thinking about it, I tried to think about it in the opposite way, in as even-handed and precise and pro-human flourishing way as possible. And usually when I talk to general audiences, I spend a lot of time on, okay, here are all the facts about fossil fuels. Now, at this conference, you've learned just about any fact that I would present in my book and that I could tell you, but the key thing is that those facts will not be processed correctly unless people have the right framework. And so once I became passionate, thank you. Once I became passionate about the right framework and realizing that framework is fundamental, I became very interested in how do I persuade people. And here is the basic thing that I do, and it's almost too simple, but it's super, super effective. Essentially, whenever I'm in a conversation, or even whenever I'm writing, I want to make sure that 3 things happen, that 3 ideas, 3 pieces of the framework get established, and that's the pro-human flourishing piece, the even-handed piece, and the precise piece. So if I'm in a discussion with somebody and some issue comes up, like the Paris Climate Accords, I don't want to jump into the facts, because how do we even know what facts to talk about or how to talk about them? I want to ask first, hey, would you agree that our goal here is we want the energy policy that's best for human beings now and in the future? And what I find is almost everyone will agree. Some people won't, but then if they don't agree that the goal is the best policy for human beings, you can't just proceed and jump into the facts. You need to challenge them, and if they're not willing to value human life, then you need to leave. I mean, when people really won't value human life, I just say, well, you know what? If you don't value human life, then you should absolutely oppose fossil fuels because you'll get a lot of people killed. And then they don't usually like that, and sometimes they then come back. So that's one thing that has to happen. Another thing that has to happen is we have to agree to be even-handed. Would you agree that to determine the best policy, we need to look at both the potential positives and negatives? And when you ask that question, 100% of people agree. I've never had anyone who said, I'm only going to look at the positives or I'm only going to look at the negatives. And yet if you don't ask that question, that's what people do all the time. They're super, super biased. So by making the issue of framework explicit, you can get people to think way better than they would if you didn't. And the same thing is true with precision. If I say, hey, do you agree that we need to be as precise as possible? For instance, when we talk about sea level rise, we have to be clear, do we mean 2 feet in 100 years like the UN says, or 20 feet in 30 years like Al Gore says? We have to be precise. And they'll say, of course. But if you didn't establish that framework, they would never do it on their own. So once you establish the framework, whether it's in conversation or in your writing, then people process the facts in a much better way. And I think the inevitable conclusion, once you start looking at the facts from the right framework, from a human flourishing-based framework, is overall that freeing fossil fuel use instead of restricting it is going to give billions more people access to cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And I see some of you taking pictures, which I really appreciate. I'm happy to send out the slides, but I'm also going to send out some handouts that will be really valuable to you. I'll tell you in a second how to get them, but including, there's a 5-page memo that we created for some government officials on all the key talking points for the moral case for fossil fuels, including the framing and the facts. So hopefully that'll be really useful to you. And so that's on the potential positives of fossil fuels. And then when people really look at the potential negatives of fossil fuels from a human flourishing framework, what they find is actually using fossil fuels is completely compatible with a safe climate and a clean environment and a long-term future. But it all comes down to the framework. So one example, this happened a few years ago, and this is when I really started getting that the key was to frame things. I got interviewed about the Paris Climate Accords, and they asked me the question, hey, do you think it's good that society is doing something about climate change? And think about it, that's a totally loaded question, because the way it's being framed is, should we do something about climate change? Which basically means the only thing we should be focused on is, are we changing climate, are we changing nature? But that's not the human perspective. And so what I did, instead of answering that, I said, and this is the actual quote, I said, anytime world leaders are gathering, their number one focus needs to be what will promote human progress. And so that reframed it from the goal is to prevent climate change from no, the goal is to promote human progress. And that totally flips it, and it totally changes it in the right direction. And you can do the same thing in any conversation as long as you're aware of making sure that those 3 things are in place. You got to be pro-human, you have to be even-handed and precise. And if you can get people on that framework, it's incredibly compelling. So the fascinating thing about framework is fundamental, so it affects how people process everything. But the right framework is super easy to convince most people of, because the wrong framework cannot survive unless it's hidden. You can't be biased and sloppy and anti-human out in the open. It has to be hidden. So if we can get the framework issue explicit, we can win over a lot of people. And I think that's really the key to the success I've had, and the key to a lot more success I can have and we all can have. So if you take one idea away today, it's that the strategy for successful persuasion is framework before facts. That is really the key, and then it should be a human flourishing-based framework. So my goal today was to convince you of this at a high level with some examples, but so you can see that, yeah, it's all about framework. And then hopefully I've given you enough to have more success immediately, but I can make it a lot easier because over the years I've developed a lot of materials that very specifically give you the exact words you need to reframe these issues in all sorts of contexts. I have videos you can share with people that frame issues the right way. I have talking points. I have stuff for companies. I have stuff for one-on-one conversations. Definitely for political officials we have things. And so I want to empower everyone as much as possible. And all I need from you is just to get in touch and to give me your email address. Now, you got cards in your goodie bag, which you probably haven't carried with you. So you have kind of two options. Easiest option, if you have a smartphone, I won't find it rude, just email me at alex@alexepstein.com, alex@alexepstein.com, and put Heartland in the subject. And anyone viewing online, same deal. So just alex@alexepstein.com, Heartland, and then we can send you all the resources tomorrow. Otherwise, you can fill out your card. So that, I think, can just, in my experience, we have the benefit of the internet where we can store information, we can share it with everyone, and so we have all these resources. They're, in many cases, just sitting there, so I would like you to use them and get a lot of really good results. One favor, since I know we have a really influential audience here, is in terms of my own mission, which is really advancing human flourishing via industrial progress, and really helping people frame these discussions better, is if you can think of any audiences like you who would be interested in this message, if in your email you could write them, particularly if there are any influential high-level audiences that you think I should speak to, if you're willing to recommend me to them, or it's your own company or own organization, if you just put that name there, that would be super valuable, and that'll help me take this message and all of those resources to other people. So big takeaway today is the number one thing we need to do is reframe the conversation based on a human flourishing framework. And easiest way to get started, email me at alex@alexepstein.com, Heartland in the subject, and I look forward to hearing all of your success stories. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everything Heartland has done to create an amazing community.